Do you remember when flying felt like an event, when you could look out of the window and see not two but four great engines humming steadily beneath the wings? For many, those engines meant confidence and reassurance. They were the symbol of reliability when airlines first carried passengers across oceans. The design wasn't just about power, it was about trust. This memory leads us to a question. If those engines once represented the safest way to fly, what made the world shift towards smaller aircraft with only two engines? And now, as the Boeing 737 faces retirement talk, what does this mean for the passengers who grew up traveling on it? The Boeing 737 isn't just an aircraft. Since its debut in the late 1960s, it has carried more than 17 billion passengers. It defined short-haul flights for airlines such as Southwest, Ryanair, and United, racking up over 11,000 orders. Generations have boarded it without a second thought, trusting its familiar shape and sound. But today, Boeing must confront a reality. The 737's long service may be approaching its end. The company faces a critical choice. Does it retire the jet that shaped modern air travel, or does it reinvent the aircraft to compete with Airbus's A320neo and new hydrogen-ready concepts? Behind that choice is a gamble that affects not just airlines, but also the memories and experiences of millions of travelers. First, let us revisit why aircraft once needed four engines. In the early decades of jet travel, regulations were strict. Authorities like the Federal Aviation Administration in the United States insisted that long flights over water or remote areas required more engines. It was not only about engineering, it was about peace of mind. With fewer diversion airports available, regulators believed that having 3 or 4 engines gave aircraft the margin of safety they needed. For passengers of the 1960s, 70s, and even the 80s, this mattered deeply. Imagine being on a transatlantic flight in those years. The aircraft is halfway across the ocean, thousands of kilometers from the nearest airfield. To hear the hum of 4 engines, each one steady and independent, gave families a sense of reassurance. Parents calmed children by saying, even if one stops, there are 3 more. Travelers trusted that redundancy was built into the system. Aircraft like the Boeing 707, the Douglas DC-8, and later the Boeing 747 cemented the idea that 4 engines meant safety. The Airbus A340 carried this tradition into the 1990s, winning loyal passengers who preferred the perceived security of more engines on long-haul routes. But technology marched on. Engines became more reliable, with fewer failures per flight hour. Rules began to change. Aviation regulators introduced new permissions, simplified as allowing 2-engine planes to fly far over oceans, known to experts as ETOPS, but better described as rules granting twins the right to cross oceans safely. These changes transformed the industry. Suddenly, aircraft like the Boeing 767 and later the 777 proved that 2 engines could be just as safe while burning less fuel and cutting costs. Airlines embraced the efficiency. Lower costs meant cheaper tickets, and passengers, even those once comforted by 4 engines, began to accept the change. Yet the memory of 4 engines still lingers for many older passengers. It was not just a technical feature, it was a promise. It said, we put safety first. And now, as Boeing considers retiring the 737, the same conversation arises again. How do passengers balance trust, efficiency, and confidence in the skies? In short, 4 engines once defined trust. Today, passengers must decide whether 2 engines and the legacy of designs like the 737 carry the same weight in their hearts. Next, let us turn to what passengers valued most: comfort. The Boeing 737 was never just a machine for moving people. From its very first flights in the late 1960s, it stood out because it felt approachable. The cabin was narrow but consistent. Travelers knew exactly what to expect. 2 seats on one side, 3 on the other, rows of windows neatly spaced. Families found familiarity, and business travelers found predictability. comfort, of course, changed with the times. Early jets were noisy, rattling machines compared to the smooth cabins we know today. But as engines evolved, noise levels dropped dramatically. By the 1980s and 1990s, high-bypass turbofan engines brought a new hush to the cabin. For nervous flyers, that mattered enormously. Many passengers recall the difference clearly, how older jets left them, shouting to hear one another, while the 737's updated models allowed for relaxed conversations mid-flight. The wings played a role too. Boeing's engineers refined designs so that turbulence felt less jarring. Veterans of early travel often comment that the 737 just felt smoother than aircraft of the same era. The climbouts were steady, the landings less bumpy, and the sense of balance greater. And comfort was not just about quiet engines or smooth rides, it was about routine. Think of the business traveler in the 1980s, boarding flight after flight each week. The predictability of the 737's cabin gave a sense of control in an otherwise stressful schedule. Or the family who flew once a year for a holiday, finding that the aircraft felt familiar every time, no matter the airline or the destination. This predictability bred loyalty. Passengers did not have to wonder what the interior would be like. Whether flying across the US, hopping between European capitals, or journeying through Asia, stepping onto a 737 was stepping into something trusted. In short, the 737 did more than move people. It gave them a calm, steady experience, something that mattered just as much as speed or price. Now, let us look at what made the 737 such a clever aircraft. Its design. Unlike larger jets that dazzled with sheer size, the 737's strength was in subtle, smart engineering. Space on board was used carefully. For example, toilets and crew rest areas could be tucked below the cabin floor, freeing up the main deck for passengers. It was not something travelers noticed, but it made their journey more comfortable. One of the more unusual design features was the gentle slope of the rear floor. At first glance, it seemed like a small detail, but it balanced the aircraft's weight and helped with boarding efficiency. Passengers moving toward the back of the plane did so more smoothly, making turnarounds quicker for airlines and journeys easier for travelers. Across its many generations, Boeing kept refining the layout. The original series of the late 1960s was basic but functional. The classic series of the 1980s added larger engines and better aerodynamics. The next generation of the 1990s brought digital cockpits, extended range beyond 3,000 miles. And finally, the MAX series introduced even more efficient engines and aerodynamic winglets. For pilots, design continuity was invaluable. A captain trained in one generation could adapt to the next without starting over. This meant airlines saved on training costs, while passengers benefited from crews deeply familiar with the aircraft. For passengers, the design meant efficiency without sacrifice. Airlines could seat more people, fly longer routes, and still maintain the consistency that made the 737 beloved. Whether you boarded for a short domestic hop or a longer cross-country flight, you found a space that felt designed with both practicality and comfort in mind. In short, the 737's design was about making flying practical for airlines, crews, and passengers alike. Before we continue, let me ask you something simple. Have you ever flown on a Boeing 737? Maybe it was years ago, on a holiday that still brings back smiles. Or maybe it was the aircraft that took you on business trips, or even carried you on your very first flight. Hold on to that memory, because the next part of this story is about how this little jet grew to meet the world's biggest challenges. And if you'd like, feel free to share your own 737 story in the comments when you're done watching. We'd love to hear it. The Boeing 737 has always lived in an interesting space. It wasn't the largest jet in the sky. That honor belonged to giants like the Boeing 747 or the Airbus A380. But What made the 737 remarkable was how it combined the capacity airlines needed with the flexibility passengers depended on. When the 737 first took flight in the 1960s, it was designed to carry fewer than 100 passengers. At the time, that was perfect for regional routes. But as the decades went by, Boeing stretched the design again and again. By the time the next generation series appeared in the late 1990s, the 737 could carry close to 200 passengers. And yet, despite its growth, it remained small enough to operate from modest airports. This adaptability mattered. Many aircraft with larger wingspans and heavier bodies required longer runways and reinforced taxiways. They were restricted to big hubs, but the 737 could serve almost anywhere. In fact, some of the most iconic uses of the aircraft came from short, rugged runways, like the old Kai Tak Airport in Hong Kong, where pilots had to perform dramatic turns just before landing, or in mountainous regions of South America, where thin air and short strips demanded precise performance. Another sign of its clever design was the landing gear. Later variants of the 737, particularly the longer ones, risked what engineers call tail strikes during takeoff. Boeing added a small but important detail, a third landing gear known as a tail skid. It wasn't glamorous, but it protected the aircraft and gave pilots confidence when operating from shorter fields. And then there were the takeoffs. Fully loaded with passengers, baggage and fuel, the 737 often required longer runs to get airborne. Passengers sitting near the wings or at the rear could feel the engines straining as the plane gathered speed. For many, that rumble and stretch down the runway became a familiar part of the travel experience. It may have been noisy compared to modern designs, but it was also reassuring. You could feel the aircraft working, and then, at just the right moment, the lift as it pulled free of the earth. Airlines valued this balance of size and capability. It meant they could deploy the same aircraft on both busy city routes and smaller regional connections. For example, Southwest Airlines in the United States built its entire business model around the 737, using it to connect secondary airports where larger jets couldn't operate. In Europe, Ryanair used the same logic, flying into regional fields across Spain, Italy, and Eastern Europe, places where passengers were thrilled to avoid long trips to big hubs. For travelers, this flexibility had a personal impact. Families could fly directly from smaller hometown airports instead of driving hours to larger ones. Communities once isolated suddenly had links to the wider world, and business people, especially in the 1980s and 1990s, found that the 737 opened up routes that made day trips possible. In short, the 737 was big enough to matter, but never too big to fit where it was needed. That was its genius. It didn't just fly people, it connected places in ways larger aircraft never could. If the technical side of the 737 made it successful, it's the human side that made it legendary. The numbers are impressive. More than 17 billion passengers have flown on a 737 since its debut, but behind those numbers are countless personal memories. For people now in their 60s or 70s, the 737 was often the first jet they boarded. Imagine the excitement of stepping onto an aircraft in the 1970s, hearing the whine of the engines, and realizing that the world was about to open up to you. Cabin crew often had affectionate nicknames for their aircraft. One jet, remembered as Delhi Mike, earned a reputation for reliability, always ready for the next flight. Pilots described the 737 as a pilot's airplane, responsive, straightforward, and dependable. Passengers, meanwhile, grew attached to it without even realizing. For many, the 737 became invisible, a trusted companion on business trips, holidays, and family reunions. Think of the school children who boarded a 737 for their first trip abroad, clutching passports and tickets while their parents tried to calm their nerves. Think of the grandparents flying to meet a new grandchild, the engines humming in the background as they crossed states or oceans. These aren't just aviation stories, they're life stories. And the 737 was the stage on which they played out. Of course, not all memories are happy ones. The tragedies of the Lion Air and Ethiopian Airlines crashes left scars on aviation history. For many, those headlines were the first time they thought seriously about the risks of flight. Families mourned, regulators demanded answers, and Boeing faced criticism that still lingers today. Those memories are painful, but they also spurred reforms, better oversight, stronger training, and new safety cultures. In that sense, the 737's darker chapters became catalysts for change. But the dominant memory for most passengers is one of trust. Decade after decade, boarding pass after boarding pass, the 737 became a symbol of reliability. Whether you were flying across the US Midwest, hopping between European capitals, or connecting remote islands in Asia, the aircraft became part of the fabric of everyday life. For older travelers today, recalling those journeys is like flipping through a photo album. The design of the seats may have changed, the liveries may have been repainted, but the feeling of stepping into that narrow cabin, 2 seats on the left, 3 on the right, the overhead bins just above, remain the same. That familiarity is comforting. And now, with retirement on the horizon, it is stirring something deeper, nostalgia. Passengers are realizing that the aircraft they once took for granted has been a constant presence for most of their lives. To many, saying goodbye to the 737 feels like saying goodbye to an old friend. In short, the 737 is not just a machine, it is a collective memory, one that belongs to all of us who ever boarded it, whether for a short hop across a state or a long journey to another continent. So, is Boeing really about to retire its most famous jet? Technically, yes. Plans are underway to design a successor by the mid-20s, but emotionally, the answer is more complicated, because the 737 isn't just Boeing's best-selling aircraft, it's the people's plane. It's the sound of engines before your first overseas trip. It's the cabin lights dimming before an overnight flight. It's the familiar rows of seats that carried you safely again and again through the decades. Boeing's next aircraft may be faster, quieter, and more efficient, but it will never replace what the 737 meant to passengers, crews, and airlines. Some aircraft become icons of engineering, others become icons of life. The 737 is both. And so, as we look ahead to Boeing's gamble on the future, we also look back on half a century of stories. It isn't just a chapter in aviation history, it is a chapter in our history. Now, we'd love to hear from you. Do you remember your first 737 flight? Was it a holiday trip, a business journey, or maybe a family reunion? Share your story in the comments. These memories are what keep aviation history alive, and your experience could be the one that brings it to life for someone else. And if you'd like more journeys into aviation's greatest icons, make sure to subscribe. Next time, we might just explore a plane you suggest, because these aren't just aircraft. They're the wings of our lives, carrying us through decades of change, connection, and memory.